Chapter 1, Room 114 Inches. I spent 11 days in the hospital 3 years ago. Nothing life-threatening, a surgery that had complications, an infection that needed monitoring, the kind of stay that is deeply unpleasant and ultimately uneventful medically. I was in a private room on the 4th floor of a large teaching hospital, the kind of place that never fully goes quiet, where the hallway sounds continue through the night at a lower volume than during the day, but never stop entirely. My room was at the end of a corridor. The room next to mine, 114, was empty for the first 4 days of my stay. I knew this because the door was always open and the lights were always off, and I never heard anyone in it, and because on my second day a nurse confirmed it when I asked. On my 5th day, I woke up at some point in the early morning. I think around 3 a.m. based on the clock on the wall, though the days and nights blurred considerably during that stay, to the sound of someone moving in room 114. Not dramatically, not the sounds of an emergency or a distressed patient, the quiet, ordinary sounds of a person in a hospital room at night, the specific creak of the adjustable bed, the soft sound of someone turning over, the particular silence of a person who is awake and lying still. I lay in my own bed and listened to these sounds and told myself a patient had been moved in while I was sleeping. This seemed reasonable. I went back to sleep. In the morning, I asked my nurse about the new patient in 114. She looked at me with an expression I didn't immediately understand and said there was no patient in 100. She said the room had been taken out of rotation temporarily. I asked why. She paused in the way medical staff pause when they are deciding how much to say, and then said that there had been some issues with the room and they were looking into it. I pressed her. She said that several patients who had previously been placed in room 114 had reported disturbances at night. She said this with the professional neutrality of someone describing a maintenance issue. She said it was probably the heating system. I asked her what kind of disturbances. She said she couldn't discuss other patients. She left, and I lay in my bed and listened to the empty room next to mine and heard nothing. That night, I woke again at approximately the same time. The sounds from 114 were there again. The bed, the movement, the particular occupied silence of a person lying awake. This time, I got up. I was attached to an F4 pole which made movement awkward but manageable. I went to my doorway and looked at the open door of 114. The room was dark. I could see the shape of the empty bed, the chair, the window. I stood in my doorway, listening to a room I could see was empty, make the sounds of someone being in it, and then I went back to bed and did not get up again that night. I said nothing about it to the staff. I was discharged 4 days later. The sounds continued every night until I left, always around 3 a.m., always the same quality, always the sounds of a person, and not a machine. I have thought about what was in room 114 many times since. I have thought about why the room was taken out of rotation. I have thought about the other patients who reported disturbances, whether they heard the same things I heard, whether they also lay in the dark listening to an empty room that wasn't empty. I have not been back to that hospital. I would like to tell you that I would handle it differently now, that I would ask more questions or investigate more thoroughly. I don't think I would. I think I would do exactly what I did, lie quietly in the dark and listen, and then in the morning say nothing.
Some things you are better off leaving where you found them.
Chapter 2, The Visitor. My aunt was a nurse for 31 years. She worked nights for most of that career. Emergency, then oncology, then a long-term care ward where she spent her last 12 years before retiring. She has seen more of human mortality than most people will see in 10 lifetimes, and she approaches it with the particular matter-of-factness of someone who has made their peace with it professionally. She told me this story at a family dinner. Not as a ghost story, but as something she had never found an explanation for and wanted to say out loud before she forgot the details. It happened in her 23rd year of nursing on the oncology ward. She had a patient, a man in his 70s, terminal. Family had been visiting daily but lived 3 hours away and couldn't always stay overnight. On this particular night, she was doing her rounds at 2 a.m. when she passed his room and saw through the window that someone was sitting in the chair beside his bed. She assumed it was a family member who had stayed. She knocked and opened the door. The man in the bed was awake and looked at her when she came in. The chair beside the bed was empty. She looked at the chair. She looked at the man. She said she was just checking in. He nodded. She did her checks and was about to leave when he said, conversationally, that his brother had just been in. My aunt knew from the patient's file that his brother had died 14 years earlier. She said nothing. She noted his vitals and said goodnight and left. She stood in the hallway for a moment and then continued her rounds. He died peacefully the following afternoon, with his family present. My aunt told me she had thought about it many times over the years. She said she had seen this kind of thing before. Patients in the final stage of their illness, speaking of visitors that others couldn't see, and that she had learned not to question it or explain it away. She said she thought of it as the dying having access to something the living don't. She said this without sentiment, the way she might describe a clinical phenomenon that wasn't yet fully understood. What she had never been able to account for as neatly was the figure she had seen through the window. She had seen someone sitting in that chair, not an impression, not a peripheral glimpse. She had looked directly through a window at a figure sitting in a chair beside a bed, and it had been there, and then it hadn't. She said she had seen a lot of things in 31 years that she couldn't explain. She said that one stayed with her more than most. She said she thought it was because of the window, the certainty of what she had seen before she opened the door, and the absence of it after.
She said some things are clearer before you look directly at them. From
Chapter 3, The End of the Hall. My colleague spent 3 weeks in a psychiatric facility when he was 26. He has been open about this. He has spoken publicly about his mental health, the crisis that led to the hospitalization, the treatment he received, and how it helped. He is one of the most thoughtful people I know, and he is precise about the difference between what he experienced during that period that was a symptom of his illness and what he experienced that he cannot attribute to his illness. He told me about the end of the hall. The facility was a converted Victorian building, old, large, with long corridors and high ceilings, and the particular atmosphere of a building that has held a great deal of human suffering over many decades. His room was toward the middle of the main corridor. At the end of the corridor, at the north end, away from the nurse's station, there was a door that was always locked. He assumed it was storage or a utility room. Several of the other patients assumed the same. After about a week, he started noticing that some of the other patients didn't walk to the end of the corridor. Not all of them. Most people walked the full length of the corridor for exercise, as was encouraged. But a specific subset of patients, he said 4 or 5 people over his 3 weeks there, would walk partway down the corridor and then stop and turn around without completing it. He noticed because he was observant and had time to observe. He asked one of them about it, a woman who had been there longer than he had. She said she didn't like the end of the corridor. He asked why. She said it was difficult to explain, but that the air was different there. He asked in what way. She said it felt occupied. He walked to the end of the corridor himself that afternoon and stood at the locked door. He said the air was not different in any way he could measure, not colder, not warmer, not any quality he could name. But he stood there for a few minutes and felt something that he described to me carefully as the sensation of being in a place that didn't want him there. Not threatening, not malevolent, just not for him. He walked back to his room and didn't go to the end of the corridor again for the remainder of his stay. On his last day, during the discharge process, he asked a staff member about the locked room at the end of the north corridor. The staff member said it wasn't used. My colleague asked when it had last been used. The staff member said she wasn't sure. It had been locked since before she started working there. He asked what it had been used for originally. She said she thought it had been the original admission room, the room where patients were brought when they first arrived, before the facility's intake process was moved to the ground floor. She said it had been out of use for decades. My colleague told me he thought about that on the drive home, about all the people who had arrived at that room frightened and uncertain, and whether some of that had stayed in the walls, and whether what the other patients felt when they reached the end of the corridor was simply that accumulated weight of all those first moments. He said it was a more comfortable explanation than the alternative. He said he had decided to keep it